My gay husband left me for a 5-year-old woman, but when he turned violent and sued me for custody of our sons, the court destroyed him, and he never saw coming. What they took away. I'm 42 years old. I work in hospital administration, and about a year and a half ago, my husband of 10 years left me for a 5-year-old woman. I know how that sounds. You know, the typical gay divorce drama where one goes off with someone younger. But the thing is, the story has so many twists that I still have trouble processing all of it. I guess I should start at the beginning. Though I'm not sure when the beginning really was, whether it was when we got married or when things started getting weird. But I'm going to start with that day in March last year, when Simon dropped the bomb on me while I was literally putting on my shoes to go to a work event. Simon and I met like 14 years ago. We got married after 4 years of dating, and we had 2 kids, Julian, who's now 12, and Trevor, who's 11. We adopted them when they were babies, a year apart, and basically our entire adult life together had been building this family. I'm not going to lie and say everything was perfect, because it wasn't. Simon was always kind of emotionally intense. Like if he had a bad day at work, he needed like 3 hours of complete attention to process it, and I'm more the quiet type. I prefer to think things through alone and move forward. That caused friction. You know, he said I was cold and distant. I said he was too dramatic. The typical couple fights that never seem to really resolve but also aren't enough to leave everything. So that day in March, it was a Thursday, I think, or maybe Wednesday. Doesn't matter. But I had to go to a hospital fundraising dinner where I work because I'm part of the organizing committee and literally couldn't miss it. I was looking for my blue tie, the one that makes me look less cadaverous under fluorescent lights, and Simon came into the room with that face he makes when he's going to say something important. You know that face. Everyone has it. When they look at you a certain way and you know something heavy is coming. He said, "We need to talk." And I thought it was going to be another conversation about how we needed to spend more time together or that I didn't listen to him enough. The usual complaints. But no. What he said was, "I'm going to leave the house. I met someone else." I stood there with the tie in my hand like an idiot for what was probably only 5 seconds, but felt like an hour, processing what I'd just heard. And the weird thing is, my first reaction wasn't to cry or scream. It was more like, oh, okay, this is happening. I need to understand the details. I asked him who it was, and he said her name was Rachel, that she was 25 years old, that he met her at the gym like 3 months ago, and they'd been seeing each other. He told me all that with an almost clinical calm, like he was reporting the weather. And I was still there processing and thinking, wait, 25 years old? That's almost half our age, and 3 months? You've been cheating on me for 3 months and you're just telling me now? I asked him what was going to happen with the kids, and he said obviously we'd have shared custody, that he was going to get an apartment nearby, that this didn't have to be ugly or complicated if I cooperated. That word, cooperated, made me angrier than everything else, because it implied that I was the one who had to adjust to his decision to destroy our family. But I didn't yell at him, didn't throw anything. I simply said, "Okay, if that's what you want, then I guess we're going to have to start divorce proceedings." And he looked at me like he was expecting me to explode or something, but I was already late for the dinner, so I grabbed my jacket and left. In the car on the way to the event, I was kind of in shock, driving on autopilot, and when I arrived and saw Roger, my coworker, who's basically my only close friend there, I had to tell him, but we were in the middle of the room, full of people, so I sent him a message that said, "You're not going to believe this. I just got dumped by a 4 or 5-year-old man who ran off with a 20-something. I'm literally a living cliché, haha." I wrote it with that sarcastic tone because that's how I handle things, with dark humor. And I hit send without looking carefully at the contact name because I was distracted greeting people. 5 minutes later, my phone vibrates, and I see that I'd sent the message to Simon instead of Roger, and Simon had responded, "This isn't funny. This is serious. You should be devastated." That seemed so absurd to me that I almost laughed right there in the middle of the dinner. Like, the guy just left me and now he's angry because I'm not sad enough? But I didn't respond because I was in work mode and needed to maintain composure. When I got home around 11 at night, Simon was still awake waiting for me, sitting on the living room couch with the face of someone who'd been ruminating on things for hours. He told me he'd been thinking and that he wasn't going to leave the house, that I was the one who had to leave if I was so calm about all this. And I said, "Wait, what? You're the one who wants the divorce. You're the one who has a mistress. Why would I leave?" He got up from the couch and started pacing in circles. And I can say now, looking back, that was the first time I was kind of scared of him, because he had this frenetic energy I'd never seen before. He was yelling at me that I was a robot without emotions, that any normal person would be crying or begging him to stay, that my lack of reaction proved I'd never truly loved him. And I was tired, like it had been a really long day. So I said something like, "Simon, it's almost midnight. The kids are sleeping upstairs. I'm not going to have this conversation now." And he interrupted me and said, "See? This is exactly the problem. You never want to talk about anything important." The next few weeks were basically a weird version of limbo, where we both lived in the same house but barely talked to each other. Simon kept seeing Rachel. That was clear because he went out the night after dinner and came back late, and I started looking for divorce lawyers and researching how custody worked in our state. Julian and Trevor noticed something was weird. Obviously, they're not stupid, but we still hadn't told them anything official because Simon insisted we had to find the perfect moment, which seemed ridiculous to me, but whatever. I wasn't going to be the one to tell them without their father present. One Tuesday night, around mid-April, I guess, I was making dinner when Simon came home earlier than normal and looked bad, like he'd been crying. He sat at the kitchen table while I cut vegetables and told me that Rachel was becoming very intense, that she wanted him to leave everything and move in with her immediately, that she talked about marriage and having their own kids, and that he was realizing he might have made a mistake. I didn't say anything, just kept cutting carrots, and he asked me, "Aren't you going to say anything?" And I responded, "I don't know. What you want me to say, Simon? You made your decision." That night was the first time he got violent. We were arguing, again, about my supposed lack of emotions, and I said something like, "I can't force myself to feel things I don't feel. If I don't love you anymore, it's because you killed that with your decisions." And he crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and slapped me across the face. I froze with my hand on my cheek, feeling how my skin burned, and he also froze looking at his own hand like he couldn't believe what he'd just done. He apologized immediately, told me he'd never done anything like that he was very stressed, all the classic excuses, and I just said, "If you touch me again, I'm calling the police." And I went to sleep in the guest room where I'd been sleeping since he announced he was leaving. Things with Rachel apparently kept deteriorating because Simon started coming home more often and in worse emotional shape. One night he even called Julian, who at that time was like 11, almost 12, and told him this whole story about how adults make mistakes and sometimes love is complicated. And Julian came to me afterwards all confused, asking why Dad was crying on the phone. And that's when I decided we had to sit down with the kids and explain that we were getting divorced, because we couldn't keep maintaining this theater where everyone pretended everything was fine. We told them on a Saturday morning, both of us together, sitting in the living room. Julian asked a lot of questions, like, are we going to have to move? Are we still going to be a family? Was it something we did? All the things kids ask in these situations that break your heart because you know their world is falling apart and there's no way to fix it. Trevor, who's always been quieter and more sensitive, didn't say anything during the whole conversation, just sat there hugging a cushion. And when we finished talking, he went to his room and didn't come out for the rest of the day. Simon tried to reconcile with me like 2 weeks later. Rachel had apparently left him for good, or he'd left her. It was never clear to me which one ended things, but the point is he showed up one night with flowers, which is something he'd never done in all our years together, and told me he'd been an idiot, that he wanted us to try again, that we'd go to couples therapy, whatever was necessary. And I looked at him, standing there at the entrance with his bouquet of roses bought at the gas station, and felt absolutely nothing, like zero. Not anger or sadness or temptation to say yes, just exhaustion and wanting it all to be over already. I told him no, that what was between us was definitely dead, and that we needed to move forward with the divorce in a civilized way for the kids' sake. He threw the flowers on the floor, literally threw them, and told me I was going to regret it, that he was going to fight for everything, for the house, for full custody of the kids, that he was going to make sure I ended up with nothing. And that's when something in me finally broke a little, because threatening to take my kids away crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. I told him to leave the house that same night, to take what he needed, but that he couldn't keep living there with us, and surprisingly, he left. I think because deep down he knew he'd lost any chance of fixing things. The following months were a bureaucratic mess of legal papers and expensive lawyers and supervised visits. Simon started missing his days to pick up the kids from school, which made me furious because he left them waiting there outside, not knowing if he was going to show up or not. Once Trevor called me crying at 4 in the afternoon because they'd been waiting for an hour and their dad wasn't answering his phone. And when I finally managed to contact Simon, he told me he'd forgotten because he was busy, as if forgetting about your kids was something normal and acceptable. I found a 3-bedroom apartment about 15 minutes from the original house, close to the kids' school so they wouldn't have to change schools, and started the process of moving with Julian and Trevor. I told Simon we were going to leave in 2 weeks, and that he could keep the house if he wanted it so badly. Because honestly, I just wanted to get out of there and start fresh in a place where not everything reminded me of the last 10 years. He told me I was being dramatic and that I was using the kids as a weapon, which was ironic coming from the guy who literally threatened me with fighting for full custody out of spite. The move was on a Saturday in August. It was horribly hot, and Julian and Trevor helped me pack their things and load boxes into the rental truck. Trevor asked if we could take the dog, whose name was Max, and who was technically everyone's but Simon never paid attention to, and I told him yes, that Max was coming with us because he was part of the family. Simon showed up just as we were finishing, loading the truck, and had the audacity to tell me I was making a mistake, that the kids needed stability and that taking them out of their house wasn't best for them, and I had to restrain myself from telling him that the only instability in their lives was him. About 2 relatively quiet months passed in the new apartment. The kids adapted better than I expected. We decorated their rooms, established new routines, and honestly, I was starting to feel like the 3 of us could be fine alone. But then Simon decided it was a good idea to get back with Rachel. Or she got back with him, I don't know. And he brought them to dinner on a Sunday when it was his turn to have the kids. Without telling me beforehand, without preparing Julian and Trevor, he just showed up with her and introduced her as his girlfriend like it was nothing. Julian called me from the restaurant bathroom and said, "Dad, the woman Dad left us for, is here sitting at our table. What do I do?" And I didn't know what to tell him, because on one hand I wanted to go there and drag Simon out of the restaurant screaming, but on the other hand, I knew that would only make things worse. The kids came back that night confused and upset. Trevor especially was angry in a way I'd never seen him, yelling that he hated his dad and never wanted to see him again. I tried to calm him down, explain that the situation was complicated and that his dad loved them even though he was making questionable decisions, but he just cried and said that if his dad really loved them, he never would have destroyed the family for a stranger. And I didn't know how to respond to that, because technically he was right, wasn't he? Though it's not something you can tell your 1-year-old son about his other father. It was like a week later when Simon sent me a long message saying he was going to fight for primary custody, that he had evidence that I was mentally unstable and that I was manipulating the kids against him. I laughed when I read it because it was so absurdly false that I couldn't even take it seriously. But my lawyer told me I had to document everything, save all the messages, all the times Simon failed to pick up the kids, all the erratic decisions he'd made, because according to her, these cases could get ugly if the other side lied enough. The custody hearing was in November, about 6 months ago now that I think about it. We both had to go with our lawyers in front of a judge who looked like she'd heard this same story 1,000 times before and was tired of everything. Simon's lawyer tried to paint me as a cold and distant father who didn't get emotionally involved with his kids, using the fact that I didn't cry when Simon announced the divorce as evidence that something was wrong with me. My lawyer presented all the documentation of the times. Simon didn't show up to get the kids, the threatening messages, even brought Julian and Trevor's teachers who testified that the kids always arrived well cared for, and that I was very involved in their education and school life. The judge listened to everything with that neutral face that judges have, asking questions from time to time, and in the end ruled primary custody for me with supervised visits for Simon until he could demonstrate stability. Simon exploded right there in court, yelling that it was unfair, that the system was against him, until the security guard had to ask him to calm down. I left there feeling a strange mix of relief and sadness, because I'd won, yes, but it also meant my kids had a father who'd fought for them only out of ego, and not because he really thought about what was best for them. Simon started going to the supervised visits, which were at a center where someone was watching to make sure everything was okay. The first months were weird. The kids came back without saying much about how it went. But over time, I think Simon started realizing what he'd lost, because he sent a long letter, like 5 pages handwritten, apologizing for everything. Admitting he'd been selfish and destructive, that he'd let his midlife crisis destroy what we'd built. I didn't respond to the letter, not because I was still angry necessarily, but because there was nothing to say that would change what had happened. We were already officially divorced. The divorce was finalized around February of this year, I think, and I'd moved on with my life. Julian and Trevor are fine now. They have their bad days, obviously. Days where they ask why things can't be like before. But in general, they've adapted to the new normal. Julian even told me recently that he prefers how things are now, that the house feels calmer, and that broke my heart a little because it meant they'd been living with all that tension for years without me fully realizing how much it affected them. I'm fine too, I guess. I'm not dating anyone and I don't think I'm going to anytime soon, because honestly, I'm exhausted from relationships and just want to focus on being a good father and maintaining this stability that took us so much work to build. Sometimes I see Simon when he comes for the supervised visits, which are now every other weekend, and I feel something like pity more than anger, because he looks aged and tired and I think he finally understands what he did, but it's too late to fix it. Last week, Trevor asked me if I'm ever going to forgive his dad, and I told him the truth, that I don't know, that forgiveness is complicated, and that sometimes the best you can do is simply let go of the anger and move forward without necessarily forgiving. He thought for a moment and then said, "It's okay, Dad. I'm fine here with you and Julian anyway." And that was enough for now, I guess.